Hello and welcome to this GigOhm Research webinar sponsored by Looker, Embedded Business Intelligence, Delivering Frictionless Data Analytics. My name is Paul Miller and I shall be your moderator today. Business intelligence and data analytics are becoming increasingly important to business decision making. We're also seeing BI tools become more accessible to a wider range of users. Some BI processes have even become completely self-service, available to anyone in the business at any time. But the danger is very real that business intelligence and data analytics remain a silo or an afterthought. It's great that everyone can analyze data, but not if they have to export it from their regular workflows and applications for analysis in some completely separate tool. Our panel today will discuss some of the ways in which BI can become more connected to the work of your business, embedded into workflows and applications, and simply available at the point of need. Before I introduce our panel, let me tell you a little about the webinar console we're going to be using. Alongside the main window showing today's agenda, you should see an area in which you can submit questions to our panel. These questions are important, and we invite you to submit them throughout the webinar. There will be time at the end of the webinar to address as many of these questions as possible, and we will also address some of them as we go along. We will also be asking a series of poll questions during the webinar. When I start a poll, you will see a multiple choice question on your screen, replacing the webinar slides. The slides will not appear again until everyone has answered and I close the poll. Finally, I should apologize for the mouse pointer that you will sometimes see wandering around your screen. As I manage the webinar, look at questions, line up polls, and generally keep things moving, unfortunately, you see that. So I will try to keep it to a minimum. Now, let me introduce today's panel and invite them to tell you a little about themselves. As I said, my name is Paul Miller. I'm going to be your moderator today. And the first of our panelists is Jen Stirrup. Hello, Jen.
Hello, Paul. Hello, Looker team. Hello, everybody. My name is Jen Stirrup. I'm a business intelligence specialist, and I'm really particularly interested in the topic of embedded business intelligence. I've been deploying BI solutions for over 15 years now, and I'm very interested in user adoption and the business perspective, as well as the technology. So that's why I feel that embedded BI in particular is very interesting in enabling users really to get the most out of their data.
Great, thanks Jen, and I'm sure we'll be digging into a lot of those topics over the next hour. Next up we have Lynn Langett. Hello Lynn.
Hi Paul, welcome to everyone who's joining us for this topic today. This is a topic that's also near and dear to my heart as a big data and cloud independent architect. As I'm building more and more big data solutions out for customers, this idea of embedding the visualized results as part of the solution becomes something that I'm charged with doing more and more. So I look forward to a fun and useful discussion today.
Great, thank you, Lynn. And last but not least today, we have Will Savage from our sponsors, Looker. Hello, Will.
Hey, Paul. Thanks, everyone, for joining. Again, my name is Will Savage. I am on the data and analytics team over at Looker Data Sciences, where in addition to normal BI, one of my many roles is working on our embedded capabilities. And prior to Looker, I came over from Deloitte, where I was doing retail analytics consulting. So looking forward to today's discussion.
Great, thank you, Will. And now I'm going to pass back to Will as a representative of our sponsor to say a little about Looker and their perspective on the space. Will, back to you.
All right, thanks, Paul. So just to give everyone a quick intro to Looker, who we are, what we do, how we do it. We are a cloud-based business intelligence software company based out here in Santa Cruz, California. And we've been around since 2011, although really only pushing ourselves out into the market since 2013. And since then, we've acquired over 200 customers, which actually does make us the fastest growing SaaS BI company in history, which is pretty cool. And you can see on the right a sampling of some of our fantastic customers, and there'll be more that you'll hopefully be reading about soon in the press. But really the reason we've grown so fast is that we're readdressing the core of BI in a way that we don't think has really happened since the days of business objects and Cognos. There are plenty of cloud tools and data viz tools out there which serve departmental needs, but we really wanted to start from the ground up, and we have some great executive leadership helping us to do so. So Looker's vision is to help organizations become not just data-driven, but data-driven together. We want to democratize data, but we recognize there's lots of pain points in doing so today. People don't trust the data, it's hard to get access, non-technical users are intimidated, ETL is painful. So where do we even start? And we'll go to the next slide to look at that. So our approach starts with a database and recognizes that over the past 10 years or so, the entire world of data infrastructure has changed. Whether we're talking about MPP data architectures like an Amazon Swift, or even just a traditional MySQL or Postgres environment, these databases have become dramatically faster and cheaper to the point where they can now be used directly for analytics and reporting and not just storage. So Looker connects directly to these databases using the existing infrastructure to do the heavy lifting and transforming the data at the time of query. Now that's new. In the old world of OLAP cubes and data marts, you transform data on the way into these intermediate data stores, or transform data on the way into your BI tool's built-in data processing engine. And you had to do that because the warehouse was too cumbersome to use for analytics. But in the new world, you can leave data where it is, bring the application to the data, and transform the data on the way out at query time. And from a pure technology perspective, that's really cool. It means your queries are real-time with no latency from collection to analytics. It means you have full row-level fidelity and no loss of data resolution. It means you can use much, much lighter weight software. And it means you've cut down on your ETL processes. But alone, that's not enough to democratize data. By going straight to the data source, we've helped an engineer, but we haven't really helped the rest of our business users. And that's because data movement was only part of the problem. Another problem is figuring out how they deal with it. So again, in this old world, you had two options. Either one, restrict data access to engineers, which causes a backlog of queries. So great, my results are real time, but it still takes me a week to get any answers, so that's not good. Or two, give everyone access to the data, either with raw SQL or a self-service tool, but then there's no data governance, the analytics are in silos, I can't trust the metrics, also not good. And so we solved this by reintroducing the concept of a semantic model, which we call LookML, to achieve consistency through agile data modeling. So before I mentioned that we're transforming data on the way out of our warehouse at query time. And LookML is going to describe exactly how that data gets transformed. So when my data team builds a LookML model, they're defining building blocks of SQL as metrics the whole organization can trust. How do we calculate click-through rate? How do I define and track customer cohorts? How does my Salesforce data relate to my transactional data, to my Stripe and my Mixpanel data? These are things that need to be defined consistently. I don't want to make them up every time I need to do a new report. And so we define these elements once in LookML, which serves as a single source of truth for the whole organization. We actually integrated it with GitHub for version control and collaboration. And now when my business users in marketing, product, and finance need to answer a question, they can take these trusted and verified building blocks and put them together on the fly to answer their own questions. And they can trust that they're going to fit together correctly, that you can actually make decisions based on those data, all without going to an engineer. And finally, to make that truly democratic, we need to make sure people can easily join this data ecosystem and collaborate and innovate with their colleagues. So as a result, Looker is fully web-based with no desktop software to deploy. That means users can log in and immediately start sharing results with each other. And that's important because we want people to have real-time conversations around the data. That's really the last puzzle piece in being data-driven together. Our customers give people access to the data directly, use LookML to make sure that they can talk to the data correctly and confidently, and let everyone collaborate and contribute. And so on the next slide, you'll see our data stack. And one of the great things about this approach is that it scales really easily. So today, we're going to be talking a lot about embedded analytics. But the idea is once you have this data model, it doesn't matter where you're deploying the analytics, you reuse the entire stack. Over at Looker, we've seen a massive increase in the level of interest around embedded analytics. And we partner with many of our customers to either OEM our product or to use Looker to create an enhanced data discovery experience inside an existing application. But we always start with the same stack, and it's really easy. We connect directly to the data still. We still model the data in LookML, and we still deploy through the web. But now we just put that experience wherever else it needs to be. Embedded analytics is actually a very natural extension of this fully web-based architecture. And I'm sure we'll talk about this in plenty more detail, but I think that's a good amount of intro for now. So Paul, I will turn it back to you.
Great, thank you very much, Will. And yes, I'm sure we'll be digging into a lot of these topics as we go along during the rest of the webinar. So let's make a start then at a reasonably high level and look at the growth of BI, the growth of analytics in regular enterprises, and try and understand and unpick what's going on there and what some of the trends might be. So, Lynn, coming to you first. There's been a lot of talk for a very long time about the data-driven enterprise and about data-driven decision making and all the rest of it. Are we there yet? Will we ever be there?
We're not there yet, but we are moving towards it at a faster velocity. So I'm often called in to help the C-levels understand what this really means for them from a practical point. And what I have developed is a 7-step process. And the first step is something I call data hygiene. It's really separate than the core of this discussion, but a lot of my enterprises spend a significant amount of time with data hygiene. So I just have to say that just to be complete. But getting to the do we have the data we need, the next step, and really part of data hygiene, is looking at what data they might be throwing away or just not using, oftentimes log data, archival data. So I start by looking at the data that's already existent in the enterprise, and at that point, then based on the business questions that they deem critical, I will start to look at things like the public data or premium data, so external data in addition to that. So this question of do we have the data we need, yes and no, we have it, but I don't know that the enterprise is actually doing anything with it. So that's kind of the beginning of the conversation. Where is the data, and what do we need to get so that we can start answering these business questions?
Good, thanks. And Jen, just following on that point about do we have the data we need, in the kind of engagements you're doing, do businesses have the data lying around and they simply want tools to look at it, or do they need to either find or create data before they can start analyzing it? Is the data there waiting to be understood, or is there a more complex process going on?
I think very often organisations don't know the data that they have. They don't know what's missing, and they don't really understand what they need. And I think they should have a roadmap around business intelligence, like a blueprint of what do we actually want and where are we going. Now that doesn't mean you go through a waterfall process of saying, well, we want a data warehouse in 2 years, but it is about taking a step back and understanding very honestly what is going on in business and what data do organisations actually need to make the right decisions. And usually when I start looking at customers' data, I do see lots of pots of data hidden around in Excel, and these are really being used to make really key business decisions. And the problem there is that nobody knows these Excel spreadsheets exist. So you end up with these very siloed data sources, and these siloed data sources turn into siloed analytics as well. And that's a real problem because people can't tell you what's happening horizontally across the business, but they can tell you what's happening in departments, but only in a siloed way. And I really think the key to embedding analytics is making that data available across the organisation so they can answer horizontal questions as well as the vertical ones.
Yeah, that's a good point, and we'll get on to the embedding side of things in a little more detail in a moment as well. Good, thank you. I mentioned multiple choice poll questions, and I'm going to put the first of those up for you in the audience just now. And while that's up there, we'll continue our conversation. And Will, just coming to you, does the business, the general business, does it understand how to even set about asking the right questions of its data?
I think many business users do. They know that when I release a new product launch, there are certain metrics that they need to be tracking, and they would need to track those, across different variants for an A/B test, for example, or they need to track customer retention and lifetime value. I think people have a good sense of the kind of metrics they want. I think the problem is more, similar to what Jen was saying, around where the data exists and the process in getting access to that data. One of the things we've seen is that organizations are collecting tons of data, and that's really, been a big factor in the self-service data movement. I think the rise of all these self-service tools really gives evidence to the fact that people are hungry for this data. But at the same time, as people have had this hunger for data, it's also gotten harder to get access to because people are storing data in Hadoop or NoSQL infrastructures that take an engineer to get access to. There's just massive amounts of data that DBAs are worried about non-technical users writing SQL against that database directly. And so I think that's what's really given rise to this self-service movement. So I think people do have the understanding of what they want to ask. It's just the processes aren't really set up to encourage them to do so.
Okay, that's a good point. And now just taking a look at the results from the poll. Will, does this look like the sort of thing you would expect to see, in terms of where customers are or at least where attendees on this webinar are in their journey towards BI?
Yeah, this looks pretty reasonable. I think a lot of times what happens is when you ask different people in an organization, they'll have a different perspective on this. Some people who are involved in departmental level analytics, so marketing analytics or finance or product, they'll really see their organization's approach to BI as based in these self-service tools. Whereas if you ask someone in IT, they'll say, that's not really a big part. We use Oracle, and we have all these technologies that we use to manage our data, and we have DBAs who do ETL processes. So I think what's going to be important is bringing those two groups together so that people have a better comprehensive understanding of how their organization deals with analytics.
Yes, I think that's probably quite an important point, isn't it, Lynn, that we're looking at here at the perspectives of people in individual units within the business, so they may not be seeing the whole picture.
Yeah, well, it's the classic, who's using the spreadsheets and who's using the enterprise reports, and how do you bridge the gulf between. This is the problem that has been existent and problematic since I started consulting over 15 years ago. So hopefully some of these embedded solutions can start to bridge this gap, because it's there, and it's, I think, just growing in the level of problems that it is producing with the advent of big data and more data.
Yeah, absolutely. Although, Jen, coming to you, you were talking about self-service, and clearly there's 30% of the respondents here either have access to it or are really putting it to use. So that's not bad.
That's right. It's not bad, but I'm wondering how much of those analytics are being shared across the organisation. So I think sometimes you get the very ad hoc analytics, which people do in their own small spreadsheets, and they might be sharing these around by emails. Or how much of that is really driving what the managers want to see and what the CXO level want to see. And I do hear from customers very often, particularly at the CIO level, they'll say things like, I don't really get the numbers that I want, and not fast enough. It takes people a month to write me a report, and I don't understand why it takes so long. And I think with the embedded solutions, it's about empowering those users to answer these questions more quickly. I think in today's world, the rate of data is moving so fast. A month always feels like such a long time, and by the end of it, the shelf life of the business question may well have gone, and the shelf life of the data might have gone as well, and it's no longer as relevant as it was a month ago. And I think about particularly embedding BI is just about making those questions across the organisation more visible and giving them the priority that they deserve.
Yes, I think that is a good point. And just very briefly, and coming to you first, Will, this notion of structured, unstructured, and semi-structured data, I guess there's a perception that the quick wins will probably come from the structured stuff. It's easily understood, it's easily interpreted, it lends itself to pretty graphs and easy charts. Is that fair, or are we actually seeing more growth in some of the other areas?
I think that's pretty fair. Obviously, structured data makes a lot of sense, for end users. I think the challenge with unstructured data that people see is that the data collection tools and the data analysis tools may not be the same, and that's a hard thing to get your head around. So, people will collect all of this, schema list data about their event logs, and then they'll see it inside of a Cassandra database or a Mongo database, for instance, and that's very difficult to analyze. But that's because those tools aren't built for data analysis. If you have a migration of that data into something like an Amazon Redshift, where you set up a pretty simple, copy job from Mongo to Redshift using, there's lots of scripts out there. There's lots of technology companies who can help you do this. you can start making sense of that unstructured data pretty quickly as long as you make sure you pick the right tool for the job.
Yeah, absolutely. Good point. I'm going to put another poll up, and we only have 3 of them. There just happen to be 2 on this particular topic. I'll put it up now, and while you're taking a look at that, Jen, we've been talking in passing several times about the importance of self-service. From the business's perspective, why should it be interested in self-service? Is it not better to entrust the data analysis to a small team of people who know exactly what they're doing and who think about it all day, every day? Why is self-service better?
I think actually the business users do know exactly what they're doing, and I really think they have such a deep understanding of the business data. I'll give you an example. I was dealing with some business users, and there was some data I just simply could not find. It was 5 years worth of data for a particular hospital. And I struggled, and eventually I said, look, I can't find this data for 5 years. And the business user said, oh, that makes total sense. The hospital closed down for 5 years, and the data was subsumed into the data of another hospital. And when the business user explained it back to you, it made total sense why the data was missing. But as a techie, I didn't realize that. And I learned a very valuable lesson, which is the business perspective is absolutely critical in making sense of that data. Because a number which might make no sense whatsoever to someone who's looking at it cold, I think the self-service piece is all about the context. And the context is critical in evaluating the data and making sensible decisions based on analytics that come out of it.
Okay, good point. So context matters. That's something we hear quite a lot, but it applies in this space as well. Lynn, any additional thoughts from you as to why self-service should be something that the business wants to embrace here?
I've had the same experience as Jen with customers where her example is probably more cleanly drawn, but where data doesn't make sense or it just is not being used. The question that I often ask when I'm starting an engagement to figure out what the situation is, I will go to the enterprise reporting tool and I'll say to the analyst community or the subject matter experts, which reports do you use and which reports do you not use and why do you not use them? And that's a really interesting question, whether it's the query runs too slowly, oh, the data is inaccurate, I had to pull it into Excel and join it with this other thing. You find out quite a lot about the state of the data in an organization by just spending a half an hour to an hour with the people who are actually using the artifacts. And it gives you a direction on which way that you might start to move. And often really you can be the bridge in communication, because the sort of traditional BI, the recipients often thought, well, they just are stuck with what they get. So they don't even really kind of have the imagination around the possibilities of embedded and drill through and that kind of stuff. So you can be quite a hero pretty quickly with some of these new products. It's actually a lot of fun.
And I guess, the whole ability to explore is important as well in self-service. You're not sending a predefined query off to an analytics team and getting a simple answer back. You're actually looking around and exploring and trying different things.
Yeah, I mean, this sounds really silly, but I've literally had people hug me because they've been so happy. It's just, the poor oppressed subject matter experts that just have to wait for those reports. When you show them what's possible and they click and they can see the source back to the data, even if it's incorrect, they can at least understand why it's incorrect. You really, you get your sort of superhero BI cape on at that point, which is a lot of fun.
So, Will, if self-service is so great, does this mean we no longer need to invest in expensive teams of data scientists?
Absolutely not. I think data scientists are still incredibly valuable for a few reasons. Number one, there's really different types of analytics when you're doing predictive modeling versus just sort of observational analytics. I think that's a great time to have those data scientists involved. They also lend a really great perspective to sort of that horizontal approach that Jen was talking about. In that poll we just showed, 38% of people said that the data doesn't all exist in one place, and someone in marketing may not know where to go to see how their marketing campaigns translated it into product effectiveness. Those are the kinds of things that data scientists can have a really helpful, wide-angle lens on. I think one of the frustrations with data scientists today is that they feel like they're getting hired to do really cool analytics, and then they end up spending all their time doing just SQL queries, and they get frustrated because that's not what their job was hired to do. So I think self-service actually frees up data scientists' time to do the thing that they're best at.
Okay, good, thank you. So we better move along and start digging down into the embedding topic, which is where we want to go. That's the particular special piece we want to look at here today. So let's try and understand what the advantages are of taking an analytics process or a BI process like the ones we've been talking about and add value to it by embedding it. And I guess the first thing to ask, and Lynn, coming to you first, embedded in what?
Depends on what the people who are going to be consuming the data are using. I mean, the broadest applicability, of course, is HTML5 or some kind of responsive web application, so that it can be consumed on any smaller size device. But that's an oversimplification of the actual requirements. Sometimes, for example, I had one that was a manufacturing floor. So they had a customized kind of tablet-like device that had some proprietary, interface. And so then it was, I think, an iframe type of thing. But that was a while ago, so that might not be the most modern approach. For me, the answer is, what kind of consumption devices are the end users using? And just to add a really sort of fresh approach on this, we're starting to see IoT stuff, I'll just start with the plethora of all the bands. So that might be a new thing, right? Embedded actually in something smaller than a phone, because as we start to integrate some of these IoT devices, that will be a new requirement. So the question really goes to who is going to look at the information, what devices do they use?
Okay, and Jen, presumably it's embedded into workflows and processes as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it should really be embedded wherever the users need it most. So that could, for example, be an operational system which is proprietary, and I'm still surprised by how many of those I see around. Sometimes people don't need to move from them, and they don't, and they still continue to function. So in that case, I think developers are increasingly required to embed analytics into existing systems to provide the information that the users need at the point that they need it in order to make the most effective decision at that particular point. And I think that's really about dot joining across the organizations. Say, for example, you're looking for customer information. That could be across the board. It could be in your marketing data and your CRM data, your ERP system, your financial system, and all of these dots joins together give you an additional awareness about that customer. And then as we move forward, it's not just data points from things, but we also move into the Internet of Things as well, where you could be collecting data from sensors or something like that, and then you want to match it up to give you a bigger picture of what's happening. But it's not just about where the data's coming from, it's about the network of the data and joining the dots together. And I think that's really the value of embedding something. It allows you to look across what's happening as opposed to just at a particular viewpoint.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree about embedding it into existing workflows. One of the things we saw a lot at Deloitte was what I'll call systems overload, that people have 10, 15, 20 systems that they're logging into to do their day-to-day jobs. And, it's easy to trivialize that as a problem, but it really does have a big impact in terms of taking that data and using it to make decisions. And you can't really collaborate and share when you've got everyone has different logins and different permissions, and you have to think about all these systems. So really establishing a single place where people can go to get this horizontal view of the business and making it shareable is super important.
And we've had a question come in from the audience, and Carlos asks, can BI be embedded in something like Drupal? And presumably the answer is just yes.
Yeah, I mean, we deal with various degrees of technological complexity. If you already have some portal that you've designed, it can be as simple as just dropping in an iframe, and that'll work. Sometimes we also have people use the API to build custom integrations if they want to, have a greater degree of customization over the user experience. One of the things we actually do at Looker is we've embedded Looker inside of our Salesforce so that when people are looking at particular accounts, they can see real-time information about that account's performance. So yeah, it's really the sky's the limit. Just got to be creative about it.
So Lynn, at what point in a workflow does it make sense to start embedding the analytics? Do you do it from the outset, as you design the workflow, or do you do it after you've understood it and after it's been running for a while and you know that it's okay?
Well, I'm a big believer in all my projects in what I call a minimum viable report. It's taking a page out of lean startup. So again, as I said when we started on this topic, oftentimes my customers really have never experienced embedded BI. They don't even really understand what it is. So I will often start with the first, POC, if you will, to go all the way through, just to show them what the possibilities are. But then when we move into a production phase, it moves more towards the end. So I like to let my customers see an end-to-end scenario with a minimum viable output that answers 1 to 3 business questions in an embedded fashion. So they can actually have the imagination to work with me and their IT team so that we can design subsequent embedded solutions that are usable to them.
Okay, good, thank you. So I'm just going to put the last of our polls up just now, and everyone can take a look at that. And while that's up there, coming to you first, Jen, who does the embedding? Is this something that's done by internal developers and internal teams? Is it done by the makers of BI products, or is it done by someone else entirely? Where is the embedding going to happen?
I think it tends to be a bit of a joint venture within the organisation. I think the thing with BI in particular is it reaches throughout the organisation. So it does tend to be developers who actually do the work, but it seems to be important that business users have the opportunity to say what goes where. And the thing is, I always think it's important to try and do that at the beginning. It's always an ongoing process. It's not something that gets signed off very easily because business requirements keep changing all the time over what goes where. But I think it's important to start right at the beginning, and it gets users into the habit of adopting the technology because they feel it belongs to them right from the start. And then they feel that they actually own the data, they can do things with it, and it's relevant to them. If they're excluded from it, it becomes hard for them to get the data that they want, and that's not good for the business overall.
Yeah, that's a good point. Will, any perspectives from your side? As a provider of some of these solutions, who would you expect to be doing the integration?
Yeah, we normally think about it sort of in 2 phases, and I'm not actually sure if I 100% agree with what Lynn was saying before in terms of sort of the process. We always like to make sure that we've got the core of BI up and running first. And of course, we're not going to do a full build out of all of the analytic use cases, but we do want to make sure that the data people are comfortable with this before we just immediately throw it out to the whole business. So normally for us, phase 1 is dealing with data people who write SQL, people who understand the backend database technology. And then once they're comfortable with that experience and with the stack and feeling comfortable that it can scale, then we loop in someone from the engineering team or a developer to sort of test out an embedded use case.
Okay, so that's presumably quite a protracted process, is it, to go through these iterations? This isn't the sort of thing you're going to knock up some analytics for after lunch.
Yeah, I mean, we try and make it as easy as possible, and again, we will limit the use case to make sure that we can do it in a reasonable time frame. Yeah. But normally we'll spend a week or 2 sort of on pure internal analytics before we really start testing out any embedded functionality, just to give people the time to really internalize it, take it in, make sure they're getting all their questions answered from a back-end perspective first.
Good point. So just taking a look at the poll results then, and I guess these are suggesting that people are moving into this space reasonably cautiously. Lynn, I mean, 48% are still trying to work out how this might fit, and only 11% are really embedding it throughout the business. Is that surprising to you?
No, not at all. I mean, it really goes right along with what I talked about earlier, where I need to actually show the organizations that I'm working with what it is, because it is a relatively new capability expressed in, products like that of our sponsor and other vendors, but relatively new in the BI market. So, most people just think, oh, it's an iframe, and that's really, what it is, and it's not. And so, part of implementation is education. So for most of my clients, I need to show them, as I was saying earlier, and I use that minimum viable process so they can actually say, oh, you see a little light bulb come on, and they say, well, I want that for this, and I want that for this, and this person wants that for this, and that's kind of the process. Now, that being said, of course, there are some early adopters out there. I have run into one client that used embedded analytics, and they have a different set of expectations around big data projects. It's kind of a hurdle or a bar you pass, or a competency, and once you have that in the organization, then you can take your use of your data even farther. So, I mean, I see it as a competitive advantage because you're allowing accessibility into your data by more of your staff, and that, as long as the data is properly prepared, that generally results in benefit to the business.
Okay, good. And just picking up on that properly prepared bit, you said there, so long as the data is properly prepared. A question has come in from Ian France, who's asking if we can talk a little bit about the processes and the requirements for cleaning data on the way into something like Looker to enable the downstream analytics to then take place. Lynn, as you were on a webinar yesterday talking about just that, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I mean, what sort of my ask of the industry, and put our poor sponsor on the spot here, is as more data comes in, more complexity, I really see a potential for differentiation in these types of products in applying some intelligence to cleaning. And it can start with just basically showing the incoming data and visualizing some core statistical information about it, so you can just see and hopefully remove things like outliers. But in some of the really advanced, and this is more enterprise-y BI, so maybe a little bit beyond the topic today, I'm seeing the application of machine learning to rate the quality of the incoming data sets and then suggest cleaning processes. I've been doing some work notably with IBM Watson, and that's clearly on the very sophisticated side of the world. But I think that the V's, the volume, velocity, and variety of data, is going to drive the need to have this combination of automating through machine learning and still allow human review. It should not be completely automated, but marry these two things together in the cleaning process, because it's overwhelming. It was difficult already in the OLAP days. Now it's overwhelming, and it stalls many a project. So we need to leverage what the machine can do for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's
Jen,
a really
any thoughts
interesting
sorry, Will, go on.
point, Lennon. Oh no, just since we're putting us on the spot here, no, I think it's a really good point about having sort of taking advantage of modern technology and automation to do some of that data cleansing. Our approach, and of course I'm biased here, is we connect to the data in a pretty raw form, and so people will immediately start seeing the data. They'll start doing queries immediately and say, okay, what, these things don't look right. We should probably improve our data model to cleanse out this data, or we need to relate the data in a different way. Our join has to work on the transformation of a field and not the field itself, things like that. And so you can really start with a basic model and improve it over time. One of the things that BI can do, though, is once you give access to the data to people, they'll start recognizing, well, what are the things that need to be cleaned up? And then you can give those back to your developers and have them integrate them into an ETL workflow. So we don't like to do too much ETL, at least the way our stack is set up. But if you do find things that you're just consistently ruling out and consistently changing, once you've experimented with that enough to be confident in it, there's definitely no harm in baking those into ETL so that your canonical data warehouse is cleaned up a little bit.
Okay, and that presumably works best where it's a steady, predictable workflow, the quarterly sales figures or whatever it is that come in regularly, always looking more or less the same.
I certainly don't.
Okay, good, thank you. So let's move on to the next stage of our discussion and talk about practically how we start doing this. And we've actually had a question come in from Lauren, who's asking, looking at having multiple systems that are drawing upon BI data, how do you deal with different people in the organization using different systems? Do you create presumably one embedding process and allow different systems to access it, or do you do this on an ad hoc basis per application and per workflow? Will?
Yeah, my bias would be towards erring on the side of exposing more, not less. Obviously, this has a big impact, or it really heavily relies on where you're embedding these analytics. So is this purely an internal embed where I'm just trying to improve the quality of my analytics workflow? Or do I have several different customers, suppliers, partners, and I want to embed analytics in the portal that shows each of them a different view of the data depending on where they're coming from? So I think you need to sort of think about that first and figure out if there are any true security concerns. But internally to an organization, we find that people who have been curating data for a while tend to have this reaction, well, I'm not going to give out more data than I need to. You're in product, so I'm going to make you a specific product embedded analytics experience. And we'd rather not do that. We'd rather have everyone coming to the same place. That's going to, in addition to avoiding the possibility of having different metrics that different people see, it also facilitates the conversation just from a cultural perspective inside the company. So unless there are true security concerns, like if you have multi-tenant data, for example, then we would say just make one embedded solution and let everyone have it.
Good, and that sort of leads on to the first point on the bullet on the slide there, Jen. Where do we put everything? Does it matter? Does it apply equally in public clouds, private clouds, running on your old mainframe in the bank, or are there particular deployment models that lend themselves particularly well to this approach?
I think in my experience I've found that analysts don't tend to care where the data is stored. They just want the data regardless of its size. And I think when we look at the cloud, I do still see organisations who can't put things in the cloud. When I deploy these solutions, I like to work on the principle of small successes. So I might just take some small pieces of data, put them together, and in doing so I like to even just make wireframes of how it might look. And what you tend to find is once you have a small success which you've proven, people start to get excited then. And once you start to galvanize the energy behind it, that's what makes it most valuable, I think, because they can see something they can hold in their hands. And I think just even a small success is better than trying to do something and chewing and biting off more than you can chew. And that would be my advice. That principle, I think, is more important than where the data is actually stored, I think.
Lynn?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself. So this idea of data storage is really interesting. And again, we had this webinar yesterday about this thing called the data lake. And people definitely have different opinions on this. And there's different arguments for different kinds of data storage. So the CTO comes to me and they've read some article about Hadoop or the data lake, and they're generally the one calling me saying, okay, we're going to do this because I can see that it's going to save a lot of money and maybe we're going to put it in the cloud. Whereas the DBA and the IT pros are, dead set against the cloud, and they want to keep their silos and they want to buy some middleware to sit on top of it. So it really is kind of an interesting situation because you have technologies and you have people. And so a lot of times my role as an independent coming in is a negotiator to try to figure out what's going to, be the best in terms of the people's skills and comfort levels along with the technologies and the capacities. So it becomes a complicated problem because of the change involved. And if you do move to something like this central repository, this data lake, that's a pretty significant change. And to find the path to get there for enterprises takes a lot longer than some out there in the industry would have us believe.
And Will, just coming to you, practically, how do you actually embed analytics into a process? Is it a series of API calls? Is it actually inserting applications, mini applications, applets into larger applications? What does the reality of making this happen look like?
Yeah, great question. It really depends on a few things. Again, number one is who's going to be seeing it, what's the application we're bringing it into, how customized do I need to make the user experience. But traditionally what we would do is we start with a simple embed, with a little applet inside another application. And this can be as basic as taking a dashboard that you've designed in a BI tool, turning it into an iframe, and sticking it inside an application. It can be as easy as that. Now, there's lots of things you might want to do to embellish that. You might want to integrate with single sign-on so that people don't have to think about multiple logins, and that's going to help decrease the friction in that workflow. You might say, well, in addition to just seeing these dashboards, I want to be able to filter the data. I want to be able to drill in. I want to be able to see every single row of data associated with these aggregates. I want to be able to add different fields or add different metrics, so you can do that. If I want a fully customized experience, maybe instead of using the dashboard as it was designed in my BI tool, I can do an API call through my BI tool and build my front end, completely the way I want. But generally, what we see is that starting with something pretty simple, like a dashboard with a few filters and some simple drilling capabilities, is enough to gauge people's level of interest. And if they start asking more questions, then you're on the right track.
And just sticking with you for a moment, Will, can an embedded solution like the ones you've been talking about adapt, or is it really about dealing with a pretty understandable input and a pretty understandable expectation for what the output should be, or is it more flexible than that?
Yeah, I think they can be flexible. I think that really actually relates to the first point, that if you have a consolidated data lake, that makes it easier to adapt. Similarly, if your entire data stack, if your entire BI stack is in the cloud, that makes it easy to adapt as well. Things get nasty when, if I want to change a question, either I have to go find a different data source, or if I need to redesign something on desktop software and then redeploy it to the cloud to be embedded into some sort of website, that's where I think people start to get friction and they feel like, well, it's hard to change these things. But if you have a really nice setup, so a really reusable stack, web-based, connected to a single consolidated data warehouse, that makes it very easy to update these analytics as you go.
Okay, good. And Lynn, just coming to you for the final point on this slide, how do we measure value, or how do we measure success? How do we know it was worth embedding analytics into a process?
The usability, the use. So literally having some sort of logging of the use and looking at the logging, because again, it's really interesting. One of how I started earlier, and I said I go into organizations to ask people which reports they use and which they don't. One thing I didn't mention there is then I also go and get the logs to see how close to what they think they use is actually what they use. So again, it's a closed loop process. So when I put out an MVP, or really along the process of the project, I will ask people what they use, but then I will also look at the logs and analyze the logs to see what they actually use, because I correlate very closely use with usefulness, which might be controversial. Maybe some people on the call don't agree with that, but that's a hard measure that I can analyze. So I look at it that way.
Will.
Yeah, I mean, we look at three hard metrics, and number one is exactly what you were just saying. That is, are people actually using it? And that's a very simple way and great snapshot of, well, do people actually value this? The second measure we would look at is how long does it take to get an answer from my data analyst team. So there will always be things I can't answer directly from self-service. I will still sometimes need to go and talk to my data team. But if that time has reduced from a week to a day, that's fantastic. And then the third thing, which is really only applicable if you're embedding analytics to third parties. So if we have customer A who's delivering analytics to its suppliers or its portals or its customers, quite frankly, can you charge for it? So people can use embedded analytics to build upsell professional services that accompany their core products. And if people really see the value in having that additional information along with the standard products, they'll probably pay for it.
Yes, indeed. That's how businesses stay in business, isn't it? Finding the additional value adds. Let's move on then to our final topic and talk about narrowing the skills gap. There's this idea, which has been widely quoted, that there's this massive gap in capability in terms of people who can work with data, analyze it, build the tools to help others analyze it. Let's talk a little bit about how true that is. And Jen, coming to you first, is the skills gap real or something that consultants are yelling about to try and sell more consultancy?
I think with the fact that there's such a data deluge at the moment, we are experiencing more and more data, and I really think as companies start to really understand the value of the data, they're starting to say, well, actually, we do need some sort of data analysts or someone who looks at data, and I think they don't always define that very well. Which I think companies are starting to look for the data scientists and people who have that skill, and maybe even a year ago they didn't really think that they needed someone with that skill set. But the thing is that data scientists are very thin on the ground, and what you need to do really is empower people who understand the business, like business analysts and data analysts, and empower them in order to do this properly, so that there's not such a burden in trying to find someone with a stats background or a maths background, for example. So I think there is a skills gap. I think people are just starting to recognise that. And it's all about, really data scientists, for example, spend between 60 and 80% of their time cleaning data. That's not a good use of anybody's time. And if they are just answering naughty questions about averages and sums and means, then that's probably, they're not going to wait around very long either. So it's about trying to give people the right answer to the right question where they need it. And I think the lines are blurring between the skill sets as well. So developers are having to talk to business analysts more than they might have had to do previously. And I think when I looked, for example, at the Looker solution, I did have a look at it in a play, obviously just to explore and see how it worked. And what impressed me most about it was that canvas where developers and analysts, business people could understand and see the data really well. And I think that blending, that touch point between those skill sets is actually a really key thing, and it was something quite unique, I think.
Lynn, what's your perspective on this in terms of the skills gap? Clearly the tools are getting easier to use and that removes some of the requirement, but are there areas that we should be concerned about trying to fill in capability?
Yeah, one of the things that I regularly do, it's really identical to what Jen was talking about, is rather than hiring a bunch of people, even though I am a consultant, I always advise the organizations add skills to their existing subject matter experts, so long as those folks are interested in learning and then that kind of thing. So one of the costs of implementation still is increasing the knowledge around a use of more data. And again, that's very specific to the particular engagement. It can be, learning some data science language. It could be learning some tool set. But the emphasis is on scheduling the employee's time to learn, which is a cost that I build into my recommendations because it's just logical, but it needs to be stated and planned for and budgeted for to ensure success in these type of engagements. Because although the tools are growing in sophistication, I find that the analysts that I work with generally need to have some sort of formal training or something to narrow that skill gap.
Yes, indeed. And Jen, just coming back to you very briefly, you talked about the amount of time that data scientists and business analysts spend cleaning data. And I think we often talk about that being 60 to 80% of the time and flag that as a problem. Now, Lewis has come in with a question saying, why is cleaning data not a good use of time? What's the alternative?
I think it's all about a blocker to insights. I mean, the cleansing data is absolutely critical. I just feel that if data scientists are spending 3 or 4 days a week just simply cleaning data, then that only leaves them 1 day out of the working week in order to actually make insights with those data. And it's not just about the time to get the answer that you want. The main metric you're actually wanting is not time to answer, it's actually time to question. Because when you give somebody a piece of information, they will come back at you with another question. And what you want to do is try to reduce that cycle of time to the next question that you get. And if your data scientist is giving you, or your data analyst is giving you an answer, but they've spent 4 out of 5 days cleaning data in order to get you that answer, then what that gives you is a dissatisfied user. Because instead of having maybe the answer in 1 day, you've had to spend 3 or 4 days actually cleaning the data. So if people can reduce that bottleneck, then it means that people get the time to question metric down. It doesn't take so long to facilitate the next question coming at you, and that's where the business insight lies often, is in that cycle of getting the answer, then the next question, then the answer. So I mean, cleaning data is absolutely critical, it is, but I think it's just frustrating for a lot of people who work in data that they have to spend so much time cleaning it to get the answer that they need. It would be much better if it was done upstream. And you can see with tools like Looker, for example, they're talking about reducing that time that it takes to get you the answer that you need by analysing the data at the query time. And really that, because you can see any issues in the data, because if you embed that data next to your application, then you're more likely, I think, to see the problem in the first place. It allows you to flag it and then go back and get the data fixed again. I just think, as someone who's been dealing with data for a very long time, that cleansing process is such an overhead. It's very critical, absolutely. I would never say that people should just go ahead with dirty data, garbage in, garbage out. It's all about trying to get the time to question, time actually down, in order to get the insights that people need.
And Lynn, presumably this plays to the point you were making earlier on about the use of machine learning and other automated tools, not to automate the process entirely, but to find automated processes or machine learning based processes that maybe get that cleaning down from 3 or 4 days to a day.
Yeah, exactly. And again, I'm just gonna point out, just because I actually have my hand in it, been working with Watson, and the fact that IBM Watson not only scores your data but recommends questions that you might ask in plain English and allows you to search in plain English. I mean, this is the direction that we're going in. It's this marriage of human input with machine learning across all of the perspectives of the stack. And this is quite, forward thinking, and it's not going to be injected into every point in the stack in every product. It's going to be differentiated. But I really do see, as I'm looking in the space in depth for some other research that I'm doing, that the companies that are providing, let's say, visualizations of statistical results so that the data can be manipulated in a more intuitive way without writing code, without, doing external packages, creating schemas. This is really going to drive the adoption, particularly around embedded, because you're going to be working with your subject matter experts in cleaning, and they generally do not have the knowledge around these traditional programming methods and ETL methods.
Okay, good. And we've got about 60 seconds left, so just coming to you, Will. If the audience is interested in beginning to put some of these embedded techniques to work in their own business, what are the first steps they should take? How do they get started on this path?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is having a conversation between the business users and the developers and the data team. I think Lynn made a really good point about, you're going to be working with the subject matter experts, and starting that conversation is surprisingly rare in businesses today. We find that when you start bringing these people together, the business people realize, oh, these data people, they're here to help me. They're not trying to make life difficult by taking a week to answer all my questions. And the data people start to say, wow, people are really using this information. It would be great if I can get them doing more. So I mean, obviously there's some practical steps, again, consolidating data, we prefer a cloud-based approach, which makes it really easy to scale embedded analytics. Yeah, you should make sure that your data is clean before you embed it. So there's practical things there, but I think the most important one is the culture and starting the conversation between the people who have the capability to build it and showing them that there is truly demand in the organization for those capabilities.
Excellent, thank you. And thank you all very much. Thank you to Jen, to Lynn, and to Will for their contributions. Thank you to all of you in the audience for your attention and for your questions. We didn't get to all of them, but the ones we didn't answer will be passed on to the Looker team, who may be able to follow up with you after the event. So thank you all very much for your attention, and goodbye.